Allons enfants de la patrie, le jour de gloire est arrivé. Contre nous de la tyrannie, l'étendard sanglant élevé, l'étendard sanglant élevé. Entendez-vous dans les campagnes mugir ces féroces soldats? Ils viennent jusque dans nos bras, égorger nos fils, nos compagnes. Aux armes, citoyens, formez vos bataillons. Marchons, marchons, qu'un sang impur abreuve nos sillons. Aux armes, citoyens, formez vos bataillons. Marchons, marchons, qu'un sang impur abreuve nos sillons.
My name is Sandy Lawrence, and I'm a docent here at the museum for about 7 years. And I have a very, very special, I'm a B-17 docent, I mustn't forget that, because I brought B-17 docents here. And I have a very, very special guest with me today. He's visiting from France. His name is Pierre Montez. He was one of the French resistance that saved my father and his B-24 crew. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about Pierre before we start. So I'm going to have my glasses here. Pierre was born in Paris in 1924 and attended school there. He's a very young man and very active as skis. In 1940, he joins the Exodus as Paris was declared an open city and finds shelter with some relatives in the French Alps. In 1941, back in Paris, he works in a factory there as an electrician. In 1943, evading draft or compulsory work service imposed by the Germans, he leaves and hides in the Alps again, and with his relatives there, he becomes a mountain farmhand in the summertime. In the winter, he works at the ski resort d'Avve as a ski operator, and from that position, he acts as an intelligence officer for the French resistance. In 1944, he actively participates in organizing the Marquis Oizen's partisan hospital in d'Avve and acts as a guide during the evacuation of the hospital with the help of a U.S. Liberator B-24 bomber crew, my dad and his crew, whose plane had crashed in the area. Pierre also assisted in the escape of this crew from the Germans and into the Alps for numerous weeks. In 1952, a self-made man, and thanks to an outstanding team of executives and factory hands, and the assistance of various acquaintances such as John Pomagowski, who invented the famous Poma lift for skiers, Pierre creates and manages a company which will build over 2,000 cable transport machines on 5 continents.
Wow.
In 1984, he retires with his technical and commercial expertise. He continues to promote cable transports throughout the world and writes the book, 11 Americans Came from the Sky and Were Saved by the French Partisans. This book is also available for loan up in the library, and there is a display about the B-24 crew and the French resistance outside of the B-17. You'll see a big display table outside of the back entrance of the B-17, so there's a huge display about this information. Before I begin, I'd like to point out my brother Terry is visiting from Minnesota. And my sister Nancy from the Sacramento area, and she would also like to say a few words.
As my sister already stated, it is with extreme pleasure to be able to introduce Pierre Montez today. Because of Pierre, my dad and the remaining members of his crew all safely returned to the United States. My brother, my sister, and I would not be here if it were not for Pierre. Pierre is a very brave, courageous man. And as he tells his story today, I want you to keep in mind that he was a mere 19 years old when he rescued my dad's crew along with the French resistance. With sincere pleasure, I would like to introduce Pierre, and we also have a translator, Beatrice, today, who will begin the discussion, the presentation, with explaining just how brave Pierre is based on his medals. So with great pleasure, Pierre Montez.
Énumérer mes décorations, c'est déjà un peu me présenter.
Telling about my decoration is a little bit introducing myself.
Cette croix rouge, pardon,
The Red Cross
c'est la Légion d'honneur
is
que
the,
j'ai la plus grosse décoration française qui m'a été remise pour mon travail dans l'industrie.
it's the highest recognition, French recognition for his work in the industry. Ski industry.
Le second, c'est la croix du combattant volontaire de la résistance.
The second one is the Cross of the Resistance. The Cross of the Resistance Volunteer Combatant.
Qui ne m'a été remise que 50 ans après.
That was given to him only 50 years later.
On ne se battait pas pour les décorations.
No, they were not fighting for the decorations.
La troisième est une reconnaissance de votre pays, l'Amérique, l'American Legion.
The third one is a recognition of your country, the United States, and it is the American Legion.
Et je suis très fier de la porter.
And he's very proud to wear it.
Ça va, attendez, je peux tenir. Pour ne pas être trop long, j'ai préparé mon speech.
In order not to be too long, I prepared a speech.
Et pour faciliter la traduction.
And to help with translation for my job.
Louder.
Can you hear? Okay.
Can you speak louder?
I will, yes.
Alors, mesdames, messieurs,
Ladies and gentlemen,
chers amis américains,
dear American friends,
merci de me recevoir dans ce musée de l'air, véritable sanctuaire chargé d'histoire.
thank you for welcoming me to the Air Museum, a true sanctuary charged with history.
Avant tout, je tiens à remercier l'Amérique et ses alliés d'être venus en 1944 sortir l'Europe des griffes du nazisme.
First and foremost, I want to thank America and its allies for coming in 1944 to save Europe from the claws of Nazism.
J'admire cette exposition et toutes ces présentations.
I admire this exhibit and all of its presentation.
Je pense à notre grand poète et philosophe Victor Hugo qui écrivait il y a bien longtemps « Objets inanimés, avions qu'une âme et la force d'aimer ».
I think of our great poet and philosopher, Victor Hugo, who wrote a long time ago, lifeless things, have you a soul that binds itself to our soul, making it love.
Oui, tous ces objets, dont le B-24, ont une âme.
Yes, all of these objects, including the B-24, have a soul.
Avant de venir à Palm Springs, j'ai demandé à Sandy si je dois intervenir, prendre la parole, quel sujet puis-je aborder.
Before coming to Palm Springs, I asked Sandy the following. If I have to talk in public, what should I talk about?
Je vous remercie d'avoir facilité mon intervention en me posant 3 questions auxquelles je réponds.
I want to thank her for facilitating my participation
by asking me 3 questions to which I will answer now.
Première question.
First question.
Parlez-nous de l'histoire du maquis français, de la résistance, comment les maquis se sont formés, où opéraient-ils et dans quel but?
Please talk about the history of the French maquis, the resistance, how was the maquis created, where did they operate, and what was their goal?
Réponse rapide.
Quick answer.
En 1940, dès que la France fut envahie par l'Allemagne, l'ensemble des Français n'a pas accepté les Allemands sur son territoire.
In 1940, as soon as the France was invaded by Germany, French people refused to accept the German occupation.
Les plus audacieux ont rejoint De Gaulle en Angleterre, mais les autres ont vécu avec l'espoir d'être libérés un jour.
The most audacious of us joined the General de Gaulle in England, but the others lived with the hope of being liberated someday.
Les Français ont collaboré avec les Allemands en facilitant leurs néfastes actions sur la France.
Some French people collaborated with the Germans by facilitating their harmful actions on France.
En échange, ces mauvais Français recevaient des faveurs.
In exchange, these bad French were receiving favors.
70 ans après, sans les excuser, je pense qu'ils furent victimes d'une forte propagande de l'occupant et du régime de notre gouvernement de l'époque.
70 years later, without excusing them, I believe that they were the victims of a strong propaganda by both the occupiers and the French government of the time.
Heureusement, les Français, les patriotes, très patriotes, se sont instinctivement liés contre l'occupant.
Fortunately, the French were very patriotic, instinctively organized themselves against the occupying force.
D'abord, par des actions simples, les Français ont montré leur antipathie aux Allemands.
First, by simple actions, French people showed their antipathy towards the Germans.
En 1943, les Allemands décident de déporter en Allemagne les ouvriers français pour les aider dans leur guerre.
In 1943, the Germans decided to deport French factory workers to Germany to help them in their war effort.
Ce fut un rejet total.
It was a total rejection by everyone.
Mais il faut excuser les Français partis en Allemagne,
But,
car les Allemands avaient dit, si vous ne rejoignez pas l'Allemagne, nous déporterons votre famille.
so it was totally rejected by everyone. But we must forgive the French who left for Germany, because the Germans had told them that they would deport their families if they refused to go.
Grâce à des conseils avisés, je n'ai pas répondu à l'appel du service du travail obligatoire.
Thanks to some good advice, I did not respond to the call of the compulsory work service.
Je devenais un réfractaire et poursuivi, recherché. Je devenais un réfractaire. Hein,
I became a defector, and as I was wanted and on the run,
En novembre 1943, j'ai rejoint le maquis de l'Alpe d'Huez.
I joined the maquis of the Alpe d'Huez in 1943.
Dans la majorité, les réfractaires, les résistants étaient des clandestins qui vivaient sous un faux nom, en ville, dans des villages, dans la forêt, dans la montagne.
Most of the defectors and the members of the resistance were living underground with fake names in villages, in the forest, and in the mountains.
Tous se livraient à des actions pouvant nuire aux Allemands en prenant des risques, bien sûr.
They all participated in activities harmful to the Germans at great risks.
Comme tous ces Français, je me suis prêté à des actions anti-allemandes, mais je ne peux en parler dans cette intervention.
Like them, I too conducted anti-German activities, but I cannot talk about them today.
Deuxième question.
Second question.
Quelle a été votre participation dans les maquis français?
How did you participate in the French maquis?
Quelle a été votre implication avec mon père et l'équipage du B-23?
What was your role with
Du
my
B-24, pardon.
What was your role with my father and the B-24 crew?
Ma principale activité dans le maquis français s'est passée principalement à l'Alpe d'Huez, à 1800 mètres d'altitude.
My main activity in the French maquis was in the Alpe d'Huez, which is about 6,000 feet high.
À l'époque, l'Alpe d'Huez était une petite station de sport d'hiver avec 2 téléskis.
At the time, l'Alpe d'Huez was a small ski resort with 2 ski lifts.
J'étais employé d'un dénommé Pomagalski.
I was working for someone named Pomagalski.
Mon travail consistait à aider les skieurs à s'accrocher à une perche pour remonter la pente et jouir de la descente sur la neige.
So my job consisted in helping the skiers to hook up on the ski lift so that they could enjoy the ride down the slope.
Je voyais passer tous les skieurs et mon patron, Pomac, très engagé dans la résistance, me donna comme consigne:
So I could see every single skier, and my boss, named Poma, who was very active in the resistance, asked me to track down all the German soldiers.
quand tu vois passer des Allemands, des soldats allemands, repère leur uniforme, leur insigne, leur armement, repère également les collaborateurs notoires.
So he asked him to track down all the German soldiers, the uniforms, the ranks, the weapons, as well as all known collaborators.
J'ai rapporté un grand nombre de renseignements comme agent de renseignement, et ce n'est que 25 ans après que j'ai appris que ces informations avaient servi la résistance.
So I gathered a very large amount of information that way, and I acted as an intelligence officer. And it is only 25 years later that I learned that this information actually helped the resistance.
En juillet 1944, je vois arriver 11 Américains en plein territoire investi par les Allemands.
Then in July 1944, here I see 11 Americans on German-infested territory.
Ils voulaient rejoindre la Suisse, c'était impossible.
They wanted to go to Switzerland, but that was impossible.
Ils sont restés à l'Alpe d'Huez au service d'un hôpital clandestin que nous installions pour les blessés du maquis.
They remained in the Alpe d'Huez and they worked in a secret hospital that had been set up for the wounded members of the resistance.
Quand les Allemands attaquèrent l'Oisan, le chef de l'hôpital, le docteur Tissot, me confia 3 Américains.
When the Germans attacked Loison, which is an area in the French Alps, the head of the hospital, Dr. Tisserot, put me in charge of 3 Americans.
Je suis sûr qu'il y avait Pachasina. Il était très grand. Et je croise Wetzinski et Wyckoff pour m'accompagner dans la haute montagne que je connaissais parfaitement.
I believe there were Pasharzina, who was very tall, as well as Wyszynski and Wyckoff, who accompanied me in the high mountain, which I knew perfectly well.
Cette mission avait pour but de repérer des lieux favorables pour évacuer des blessés et l'ensemble de l'hôpital en cas d'invasion.
Our mission was to scout the best area to evacuate the wounded and the whole hospital in case of an invasion.
Les Allemands attaquèrent l'Oisan avec pour consigne d'exterminer tous les maquisards et ne faire aucun prisonnier, et d'achever les blessés comme il l'avait fait pour l'hôpital du Vercors.
The Germans attacked Loison and were ordered to exterminate all the members of the Maquis, to not take any prisoner, and to execute all the wounded, as they had previously done at the Vercors hospital.
Avec l'aide précieuse de nos 11 Américains, malgré de gros sacrifices, l'hôpital a sauvé tous ses blessés et son personnel.
With the precious help of our 11 Americans, despite huge sacrifices, the hospital saved all of its wounded and the personnel.
Les Allemands recherchaient l'hôpital pour le détruire.
The Germans were looking for the hospital to destroy it.
Ils ont affronté les maquisards en haute montagne.
They faced our Maquisards in the high mountains.
Les Allemands ont laissé 11 morts sur le terrain.
The Germans suffered 11 losses.
Aucun maquisard ne fut blessé. L'hôpital était sauvé.
No resistant member was wounded, and the hospital was saved.
La troisième question, Pierre Montez répondait aux questions de l'auditoire. Oui, alors, des photos.
So he's going to show some photos and talk about it.
Alors, voilà l'équipage que je n'ai pas connu dans cette tenue.
So here's the crew that he never met in this uniform.
What's his name? What's his name?
Ray Swazinski.
Ray
Copilote.
Swazinski,
He was the co-pilot.
the co-pilot.
Ils étaient à leur 44e mission sur l'Europe.
They were at their 44th mission in Europe.
Quand ils revenaient, la guerre était finie pour eux, ils rentraient en Amérique.
And when they were coming back, the war was finished for them. They were just going back to the US.
Et le sort a voulu qu'ils tombent sur le territoire français.
And fate wanted that they fell on the French territory,
Territoire occupé.
which was occupied.
Avec des Français, ils ont été ceinturés par des Français qui n'avaient rien à se mettre comme vêtements.
So they were held by French who had nothing to wear as clothing.
Et nos Américains, très rapidement, se sont largués, ont donné leurs vêtements qui étaient en peau de mouton, qui étaient formidables pour les Français.
So very quickly, the Americans gave their own clothes that were made in sheep wool, which was really nice and warm.
Immédiatement, ils ont été emmenés dans le maquis de Réalon.
So they were immediately taken to the Maquis of Rialon,
Où ils ont retrouvé d'ailleurs 2 Français qui étaient venus en Amérique en 1930 comme bergers et qui parlaient un peu français, un peu anglais.
Okay. And there they met 2 French people who had been to the US as sheep herders in 1930, and they talk a little bit of English.
Voilà nos 11 Américains à environ 3000 mètres d'altitude.
So here the 11 American crew member,
Je crois le 20
Thousand.
août 1944.
probably the August 20th, 1944.
Ils se préparent à rejoindre la vallée parce que les Allemands ont été repoussés.
So they're getting ready to go back down to the valley because the Germans have been pushed back.
Vous pouvez remarquer le commandant de bord qui a ici un pansement. Le commandant de bord, Ken,
Okay.
qui a un bandeau sur l'œil.
The commandant has a
Patch.
thank you, a patch.
And he was the pilot.
He was a pilot, yes, that's right.
À l'atterrissage, oui, il a été très choqué et il est donc, il et abîmé.
Yes, that happened when they crashed.
À noter que tous ces Américains ont été embarqués sur un B-24 et ils n'avaient jamais sauté en parachute.
All these crew members, these American crew members, were on the B-24 and they had never jumped with a parachute,
Sauf Peterson.
except Peterson.
L'hôpital a dû évacuer en haute montagne.
So the hospital had to evacuate in the high mountain.
Et comme je vous l'ai dit tout à l'heure,
And as I said earlier,
avec 3 Américains,
with 3 Americans,
j'ai établi le parcours pour évacuer cet hôpital.
I set up the itinerary to evacuate this hospital.
That's Pierre right there with the shirt off.
Oh, okay.
Pierre,
Pierre.
19 years old.
hey, petit homme. Noël Monod. Noël Monod, ça serait long de raconter son histoire,
It would be a little long to tell his story. No,
mais il venait avec moi
he was coming with me
la nuit
at night,
où j'avais installé des phares
or
dans le but d'obtenir des parachutages anglais.
where I had set up some lights in order to get some droppings from supplies from England.
Alors je vous signale au passage que les Anglais, sachant que l'occupant allait venir dans l'Oisans,
So I have to mention that the English, knowing that, sachant que quoi?
a largué des conteneurs à 30 secondes plus loin sur un autre massif.
Oh, so they dropped the supplies 30 seconds later on a different mountain.
Ce maquis de Beldon était dirigé par, je résume, des communistes.
So that particular maquis was led by communists.
Quand les partisans du maquis de l'Oisan sont arrivés, ils ont été reçus avec des mitrailleuses en batterie et on leur a dit « vous foutez le camp ».
So when the resistance from the Loison arrived there to get the supplies, they were met with machine guns and they were told to just leave.
Il faut dire qu'à cette époque,
At that time,
s'il n'y avait pas eu un dénominateur commun de mettre les Boches à la porte,
if there hadn't
c'était la
been,
guerre civile.
yes, at that time, if there hadn't been this common denominator of, this common goal of getting rid of the Germans, it would have been a civil war. It was that tense.
One further comment on Noel. He went on to become the first and only treasurer of the United Nations. And for 20 years, he was a treasurer of the United Nations. And he and Pierre came over to the States after World War II. And Noel stayed here, and Noel actually found the United Nations building that he took to Rockefeller to buy. And then Pierre decided he wanted to stay in the building business, and he went back to France. But Noel went on to become the first and only treasurer of the United Nations. Thank you.
L'ordre d'évacuer l'hôpital a donc été donné
So here
et
they
sur un
were,
premier parcours, nous avons pu bénéficier de charrettes.
okay, so here they was the order to evacuate the hospital, and on the first leg of the trip, they had some carriages.
Vous pouvez remarquer qu'il y a des mulets.
And there's some mules.
Quand nous sommes allés réquisitionner les mulets, les propriétaires m'ont dit « on ne vous donne pas les mulets ».
So when they went to get some mules, the owner said, no, we don't want to give you the mules.
Mais ils ont accepté parce qu'ils pouvaient accompagner les mulets.
But they only accepted because they could actually go along with the mules,
ce qui a été précieux pour nous.
which was really precious for them, for us.
Vous pouvez remarquer qu'il y a là une jeune femme
You can notice there's a young woman here
qui a d'ailleurs des souliers avec des talons hauts
She has high heel shoes,
et qui accompagne son fiancé qui a été amputé.
oh, and she is she's accompanying her fiancé who was amputated.
Elle ne l'a jamais quitté.
She never left him.
Après les charrettes, les mulets ont transporté des blessés et du matériel et du ravitaillement.
So after the carriages, they couldn't take them anymore, so the mules were just carrying everything, the food and supplies and everything.
Excuse me, Pierre, Montez. Ce gamin a 17 ans.
This young man is 17 years old. This teenager is 17 years
Il y
old.
a 3 jours, il a participé à un combat dans une autre région et il a pris une balle dans l'œil.
3 days prior, he participated in a fight in another region and he had a bullet in the eye.
Il a été énucléé, on lui en a enlevé un œil dans l'hôpital il y a 48 heures.
And 48 hours before this picture, they had taken out his eye. In that hospital, they were evacuated.
Le voilà dans la nature, soigné par 2 médecins.
So here he is being taken care of by 2 doctors in the middle of nowhere.
L'hôpital a évacué à 2700 mètres où il n'y a plus aucune végétation.
So the hospital was evacuated to 2,700 meters, which is about 900 feet, where there was absolutely no vegetation.
Pendant 3 jours, les Américains et le maquis n'a survécu qu'avec 3 biscuits par jour et 2 bouts de sucre.
So for 3 days, the Americans and the members of the resistance survived with 3 cookies and 2 sugars a day.
Les troupeaux de moutons qui étaient dans la montagne, sur des herbages,
The herds of sheep that were in the mountain
ont été effrayés par le canon qui tonnait dans la vallée.
they were they got scared of the cannons that were in the valley.
Ils ont pris de l'altitude
They went higher in the mountain,
et nos vaillants Américains ont capturé un mouton.
and our brave Americans captured sheep.
Alors, excusez-moi, chers Américains, mais quand je pense que ces trois Américains, sur le B-24, ont largué des bombes de 2 tonnes, d'1 tonne, 2 tonnes, peu importe, ne savaient pas tuer un mouton.
So he says, I apologize, but you think that these 3 Americans who had used to drop 1 or 2 ton heavy bombs, they were not able to kill a sheep.
C'est donc un Espagnol qui, je crois, là, à son couteau,
So
a tué le mouton.
it's a Spanish man he has a knife there, and he's the one who killed the sheep.
Et nos Américains ont d'abord mangé du mouton cru.
And our Americans ate first raw mutton.
Ah voilà, ils sont en train de dépecer une partie du mouton.
So here they are skinning the sheep.
Je suis monté avec de la farine.
So he went up with, he climbed with flour,
Mais on ne pouvait pas faire de feu,
but they couldn't
craignant
make it.
le passage d'avions allemands.
But they couldn't make any fire because they were worried about German flights.
Alors l'équipage s'est réfugié près d'un ruisseau qui écumait de l'eau et qui ne permettait pas d'être repéré.
Okay. So the crew took refuge by a river like this that had a lot of, yes, thank you, waterfall, I can't find the word, and so that it would allow them to not be seen.
Avec de la graisse de mouton, de la farine, ils ont fait quelques pains.
So with sheep fat and flour, they made a few breads, pieces of bread.
Le maquis n'empêchait pas d'être propre.
The being in the resistance didn't prevent them from being clean.
Voilà le refuge, oui, le refuge. Vous pensez bien qu'il était impossible de loger 30 personnes là-dedans.
So here's the refuge, the high mountain refuge, the little house and a half. And of course, it was impossible to lodge 30 people in that little cabin.
Et nos 11 Américains, à proximité de Pierre, se sont fait des petits refuges, au moins contre le vent.
And our Americans with stones that made little refuge, little shelters against the wind at least. Okay. So now we're open to questions and answers. Yes, sir.
Je réponds.
He answers. Yes. First question.
Ask Pierre to comment when they were shaving the Americans. Pierre told us 40 years later, the reason they were doing that is because the Nazis were so close, they were afraid that the Americans would look like Marquis and be killed.
Ah, okay.
Has asked him to comment on that.
Alors, elle dit que la raison pour laquelle ils se rasaient, c'est qu'ils avaient peur que si les Allemands étaient venus de la raser,
C'est possible. It's possible.
It's possible.
C'est comme. Question.
Yes.
Were any of his family at risk?
Est-ce que les membres de votre famille étaient
Non.
No.
Ils étaient à Paris
They were in Paris.
et mes parents n'ont pas été inquiétés.
His parents didn't have any problems.
Yes, however, if he had been captured, what would the Germans done, and would they have tried to find his family to put pressure on them?
Si vous aviez été capturé par les Allemands, est-ce que les Allemands auraient été capturés? Est-ce qu'ils auraient trouvé?
Mais j'ai été capturé par les Allemands.
He was captured by the Germans.
Je revenais du lac Lafare avec Pomagalski dans la nuit
He was coming back on one
et
night,
les Allemands étaient déjà postés sur les sommets.
and the Germans were already on the summit.
Et le lendemain matin,
And the next morning,
j'ai entendu frapper à ma porte.
he heard knocking at the door.
J'ai eu la frousse de ma vie.
He had his life.
D'autant plus que depuis ma fenêtre, j'avais vu les Allemands postés.
And even so that from his window he had seen the Germans at their post.
Et les Allemands voulaient savoir qui étaient ces deux personnes qui, dans la nuit, étaient descendues au village.
And the Germans wanted to know who are these two people that came down to the village in the middle of the night.
J'ai été interrogé par le colonel allemand.
He was interrogated by the German colonel.
Il avait à droite un soldat qui consultait des papiers.
He had on his right a soldier that was looking at papers,
et un autre qui écrivait.
and another one that was writing.
Papier. Il m'a demandé mes papiers.
They were asking him his papers.
Ma carte d'identité était Paris.
So his ID said Paris.
J'avais 20 ans.
He was 20 years old.
Vous êtes un terroriste.
So they told him he's a terrorist.
Il faut dire que c'est à noter quand même
I have to mention
que
that
avant d'être interrogé,
before being interrogated,
j'étais très impressionné et d'un coup, je me suis senti fort.
so before he was interrogated, he was very anxious, and suddenly he felt strong.
Et je n'avais que du papier pour me défendre.
And all he had was paper to defend himself,
Et le mensonge.
and lies.
Qu'est-ce que vous faites ici?
So what are you doing here? He said.
Cet hiver, je travaillais avec ce monsieur sur le téléski là-bas.
So that winter, he was working at the teleski at the ski station.
Lui avais-je passé les perches? Je ne sais pas. Est-ce que je l'avais aidé à prendre le téléski? Je ne sais pas.
Okay. He didn't know whether they had helped him go on the, hook up on the teleski. He wasn't sure. But he was saying everyone.
Et maintenant, que faites-vous?
And now what do you do?
Je travaille sur la construction d'un autre téléski.
He says, I'm working on the construction of another ski lift.
Mais vous habitez Paris, pourquoi êtes-vous là?
But you live in Paris. What are you doing here?
Un docteur bien intentionné m'a découvert la tuberculose.
So a well-intentioned doctor discovered that he had tuberculosis.
J'avais un certificat.
And he had a certificate to prove it.
Et comme les Allemands craignaient la tuberculose,
And the Germans were very afraid of tuberculosis.
il a plié mes papiers et je suis reparti dans le maquis.
And so they folded his papers, gave them back to him, and he went back to the maquis.
Thinking.
Ok?
Okay. Merci.
Question,
Yes.
did he ever work with any of the English underground that helped the French resistance?
Est-ce que vous avez travaillé avec les membres de résistance anglaise qui ont travaillé?
Non, pas du tout.
Not at all.
Pas du tout. J'étais seul.
Vous étiez seul?
J'étais seul, oui. Enfin, seul. Avec tout le monde.
Yes,
Non, j'étais clandestin.
Mhm.
Ça voulait dire que on connaissait personne. Et il valait mieux connaître le moins de monde possible.
So he said, no, I was alone, and I was clandestine, I was on the ground, so it was better not to know anyone. Basically, they were alone.
Sir, how long was the trek between where you were at the hospital and taking the American pilots to, was it Switzerland? How long was that?
I think I went to Switzerland.
How far?
Combien
What-
de temps a duré le voyage entre l'hôpital et la Suisse?
Ah non, 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 oui. Non, on
Le
va pas.
voyage a duré combien de temps?
3 semaines.
Okay, so the trip lasted 3 weeks, but they did not make it to Switzerland. They could not.
Have you ever heard of a person by the name of Virginia Hall? She was with OSS. She worked with the resistance. She's an American.
Virginia Hall? Est-ce que vous
Very
avez
famous
entendu
person.
quelqu'un qui s'appelle Virginia Hall? American?
Ah non, comment?
Virginia, is that a woman name?
Yes.
Virginia Hall.
She wrote a book, Wolves at My Door.
Elle a écrit un livre. Non, he didn't.
Yes. Were you with the Americans when they were liberated, and when and where were they liberated?
Est-ce que vous étiez avec les Américains quand vous êtes libérés et où étaient les Français?
Oui et non.
Yes,
Yes and no.
Euh, la guerre était très avancée
The war was very advanced,
et les officiers américains sont venus à la rencontre des 11 Américains.
so American officers came and met the 11 Americans.
Alors les Américains étaient quand même une charge.
The Americans were a charge, I mean, they were, you know,
Et l'envoi a
responsibility.
dit, allez. Et le commandant du maquis a dit, allez, prenez-les vite.
So the commandant of the resistance said, okay, take them.
Merci.
More question? Yes, no.
Pierre, when were you able to go home finally, back to your family in Paris?
Quand est-ce que vous avez pu rentrer chez vous dans votre famille à Paris?
Ma famille n'étant pas atteinte par la guerre, et moi, j'étais un passionné de la montagne et des ski lifts, je ne suis rentré à Paris qu'au mois de janvier 1945.
His family was not touched really by the war, and he was passionate by the ski lifts and the mountains and all that. So he only came back to Paris in January 25.
J'ai repris mon travail dans un atelier de réparation de moteurs électriques, mais j'étais dans une cage.
So he started again his work as
Dans une cage.
electrical repair, but he was like in a cage.
Alors, comme j'avais un tempérament, je crois, de bagarreur,
Since he has a kind of a temperament of fighter,
j'ai été délégué syndical
so he was a union representative,
et je me suis fait mettre à la porte de mon entreprise.
and he got fired.
J'étais libre.
So he was free.
J'ai rejoint Pomard
So he went back to see Poma, his old boss,
et j'ai commencé une carrière dans les remontées mécaniques.
and he started a career in the ski lifts, which earned him this medal.
Et toute ma vie, sous toutes les formes, j'ai aidé les gens à remonter la pente.
And all of his life, and in many different ways, he always helped people to go up the slope. You know, figuratively and yes.
Pierre, will you be writing a book of your experiences with the Marquis? Is there your personal experience?
Il demande si vous allez écrire un livre avec cette expérience.
Ben, j'ai écrit 11 Américains tombés du ciel.
He already wrote a book called 11
oui.
Americans
Okay.
Fell from the Sky, I think it's called.
Avec une préface de Pierre Salinger,
With a pre-word of Pierre Salinger.
Was this your most exciting experience during the war? As a resistance?
in English.
Est-ce que c'est l'expérience la plus impressionnante de la guerre?
J'ai eu tellement d'expériences que la guerre, elle est permanente.
He had so many experiences that, you know, war is permanent.
Yes. Thank you for everything you did.
Merci pour tout ce que vous avez fait.
How did
Merci beaucoup.
the
Yes.
airdrops know how did they communicate with the resistance for the airdrops of supply?
Okay.
How did they coordinate that?
Comment est-ce que vous pouvez communiquer pour avoir les avec la résistance? Comment est-ce que la communication se faisait?
je savais que en mettant trois feux en triangle, c'était pour obtenir des parachutages anglais. C'est tout ce que je savais.
All he knew is that if he had 3 lights, he could get the English, I forgot the word again. Drops, yes. That's all he knew. So he had the 3 lights and then he would get the, that was the only communication.
Parmi les chefs de la résistance,
Among the head of the resistance,
il y avait des communications radio.
there were radio communication, but only with the heads of the resistance.
Mais moi, je n'avais pas de communication radio.
But he had no radio communication. Yes?
I understood that in the members of the resistance didn't know many of the other ones by name, so if they got caught, they couldn't reveal who they were. Was that the case with him too?
So, il comprend que les membres de la résistance ne se connaissaient pas pour ne pas, parce que c'était le cas.
Ah oui, oui.
Totally right, yeah. They had to know as little as possible, not to implicate anyone. Anyone? Yes.
How did you know who were true patriotic resistance versus collaborators wanting to infiltrate the Maquis?
Comment est-ce que vous saviez qui étaient des vrais résistants ou qui étaient des collaborateurs?
C'était difficile à déceler.
Very hard to know.
Mais ceux qui mangeaient bien, on pouvait douter. Parce que où se ravitaillaient-ils?
Those who ate well, you know, they had doubts because where did they get the food? There was no food.
I also wanted to let you know, thank you very much, Pierre.
Thank you.
And I wouldn't be here without the French and Pierre and the French resistance, so thank you. Yeah. Pierre has 40 different pictures that he has on a laptop, and he's going to have this displayed back by the display that I was talking about, the huge display table. It's like 12 feet by 5 feet display table back at the by the B-17 back by the back door of the X of the B-17, and he will be back there for the rest of this afternoon with his lovely interpreter, Beatrice. Thank you so much.
And we'll also have there was an NBC Today show that did an 11-minute segment on it, and we have that on tape on Nancy's computer back there too.
And we have also a handout that was done in the Reader's Digest about the whole story. If you'd like a copy of that, we have lots of those handouts.
And feel free to ask us questions. In 1985, Pierre actually invited the crew and the families back to France to retrace the steps that the crew had taken. He has, even though he was only with them for 3 weeks in 1944, he actually researched the whole trip, and it was actually about 6 weeks that the crew was behind enemy lines. And they were handed off from one resistance group to another, but it was 3 weeks that Pierre helped with the evacuation of the hospital. So we were very fortunate in 1985 to be able to go back to France and retrace these steps, learning more about what happened at each way with my dad's crew. So feel free to, if you want to ask us any questions too, we know a little bit about it. But
The propeller and the bomb.
yeah, so we actually were taken to the crash site, and there was a gentleman there who actually still had the propeller from the B-24, and this was 40 years later, 41 years later. And Pierre had asked, can we have the propeller? to show the Americans, and he said, "You bring the Americans to me and I'm just with them." So there is actually a memorial on that hillside now, with the prop still there, and so the memorial to that. And there was actually women that came, they had wonderful receptions in all of the little villages, and some women actually came forth with pieces of silk, because when the guys had parachuted, the women gathered up all the silk and made blouses from them, and so they still had some of these blouses and pieces of silk that they had gathered up and had kept all those years.
What was their mission and what brought the plane down?
They were on their way to Munich, on the railroad yards in Munich. It was their 44th mission for the Sorgenfrey crew. And on the way to the mission, they had actually lost one of the engines, and the B-24s had 4, and they thought many of B-24 had flown on 3 engines. So they continued on to Munich, lost an additional engine over Munich, and dropped their bombs, and thought that they were going to try for Switzerland. And it was Switzerland being neutral at that time. A lot of cloud cover that day. The instruments were kind of wacky on the plane from all the flag it had taken. Dad tells the story when they asked their navigator, Pacazina, "We've got to go to Switzerland. How do, you know, we're chart for Switzerland," and Packy said, "Turn left." So what they were trying for Switzerland, but the 3rd engine started sputtering, and that's when Dad and the pilot said, we've got to bail out. So until they hit the ground and the Frenchmen came up to them, they didn't know where they were. They had no idea. There were 2 German strongholds near the crash site, so the Marquis knew immediately to snatch them up and get them up into the forest. And the Nazis were actually on the crash site within 30 minutes and were very angry that they couldn't find this American crew. And so they kind of tried to find the Americans through the whole trek through the Alps. And even at one point, the collaborators came to some of the Marquis and said, "The Germans are pressuring us. They know that the Americans are safe. Give us 2 of them." And the Marquis said no. And so consequently, they were saved. And there was very interesting stories all along the way, including at one point, they had to climb over a 13,400 foot pass because the Nazis were, it was in the stronghold area and they were getting closer to them. And so 2 of the youth in mountain, which is this little pin that I have, the youth in mountain were another part of the resistance that were mountaineers. They had grown up in the Alps. And their mission was to stay in the Alps, help with the resistance. And so they led the guys over Jouvernay Pass. And Dad would tell the story that they were still in their flight shoes with slippery bottoms, and they're slipping and sliding trying to cross this pass. And Dad would tell the story, "Well, how far?" And the French would say, 2 more hours. And 2 hours later, they would say, "How far?" I'd say 2 more hours. So we grew up, after hearing that story, if we were ever on a long trip or bored with something, we'd go 2 more hours.
But was it a 22-hour walk?
It was a 22-hour walk, but they actually marched them, they kept them going up the mountain for 18 hours the first day, up to one of the refuge, and then were able to get back down into the other side of the mountain. And then on, this was all before Alpe d'Huez. So even at one point, the crew had been trained that if their bomber were to go down, they still needed to try and get to Switzerland. So at one point, before Pierre's group had them, the pilot said to the Marquis, "We're going to try for Switzerland. You know, how do we get to Switzerland?" So they took them to a certain place and said, "Follow the valley to Switzerland." And the crew wandered for 2 days and finally ended up staying in this church. And they didn't know but the resistance hadn't given up on them. They were trailing him. And when they got to the church, they approached him again and said, Dad said that a gentleman came to them with a dictionary with English in it and pointed to the word trust. And so then they once again joined up with resistance and continued on to El Paduet.
Is your dad still alive?
No, he passed away in 2000.
Who initiated the reunion to get together with Becky and
There, in I think it was '82, the country of France made my dad's crew honorary members of the French Marquis, and there's a memorial in France with my dad's crew's names on it because of their actions in helping to evacuate the hospital. So in 1982, Pierre contacted Ken Sorgenfrey, the pilot, and said, can any of you come to France? The crew is being honored in France. That started, we need to get together with the whole group. So in 1984, Pierre and Noel and several other Frenchmen came to the United States. And that's when he shared with us, I want you all to come to France. So it's in 1985 then that we went to France and retraced the steps that the crew had taken for the entire 6 weeks.
By the way, Ken Sorgenfrey, we have his interview upstairs. We interviewed him several years ago as part of our oral history project, and it's been transcribed, and his story is up there too, and it relates a lot of this stuff. So sometimes you're up in the library, just look up Ken Sorgenfrey. His video's there as well as his writing.
A couple of other stories about their crew prior to that. They were came over their bomb site. They had their bomb bay doors open, ready to drop their bombs, and they took an 80-inch shell up through the open bomb bay doors, through the catwalk, through the roof of the plane. Never exploded. And it's supposed to explode at a certain height or in contact. And another time, I had taken my parents down to the 15th Air Force, had a reunion in Colorado Springs. And a gentleman came up to me, and the last day we had a group with just the 460th, which my father was a member of. And he said, you're a little young to have been to 460th. I'm wondering why you're here. And so I told him what my dad, he said, he said, he'd only flown 3 missions. And he said he got shot up, and he said, and they jumped, and he spent the rest of the war in prisoner of war camp. And he said, I'm wondering if your dad was on this mission this day. And this is Jerry Conlon I'm talking about. And I said, come on, I'll introduce you to him. And I took him over to him, and he told about how there was a box of 6. He said, and we came into this cloud cover. He said, and we all went above because they're on radio blackout because they're getting close to the drop. And he said, and here comes about 30, 40 Messerschmitts down on us. And he said, we all got attacked. He said, and we got shot up. And he said, and I lost 3 members of his crew. And he said, I was wondering if you were on that mission. He said, there wasn't 6. It was 7. He said, we saw them coming. And we dropped our bombs in the spot. He said, and we redlined. He said, we put the nose down. We got down back in the clouds. He said, and we leveled out and flew along until we came out and caught up with another group. And the other rest of the box all got shot down. I want to say there was something like 18 people killed in that on that day.
What was the date of the incident, the bailout plane crash?
July 19th, 1944.
It was all for its gunner's birthday. That was his birthday present. No, tail guns.
Would like to say something.
Je suis content d'être devant des Américains
He's very happy to be in front of Americans
parce que vous êtes des gens avec qui on peut parler franchement.
because you are people that you can speak honestly with,
Et
frankly.
je réfléchis beaucoup,
I think a lot about,
comme bien d'autres,
like others,
Et on est dans une situation mondiale
We're in a world situation,
Très
global
exceptionnel.
situation, very exceptional.
Nous sommes au début de la Troisième Guerre mondiale.
We're at the beginning of the Third World War.
Qu'est-ce qui va se passer?
What's
On
going to
ne le sait
happen?
pas trop.
We don't know.
Mais je voudrais rappeler que
But I would like to remind
un Français, Malraux, qui a été ministre de la Culture,
that the French, whose name is Malraux, who was a Minister of Culture
et un ami de De Gaulle,
and a friend of General de Gaulle,
a écrit il y a une cinquantaine d'années,
wrote about 50 years ago,
le 21e siècle sera religieux ou ne sera pas.
the 21st century will be religious or will not be.
Sans rentrer dans le détail,
Without going into details,
je donnerai ma conclusion à Paul-Émile Victor,
I will give my conclusion to Paul-Émile Victor,
un grand aventurier de l'Arctique et de l'Antarctique,
a great adventurer of the Arctic and Antarctica,
qui a dit
who said,
pour vivre, l'homme a besoin de croire.
in order to live, man needs to believe.
Une religion, une femme, une discipline quelconque, une politique,
A religion, a woman, activity of some sort, politics.
et comme il ne voulait pas donner une directive,
And since he didn't want to give direction,
il a dit,
he said,
il faut croire au Père Noël.
you have to believe in Santa Claus.
Croyons au Père Noël.
Let's believe in Santa Claus.
Thanks to our friends.